Most people would say that US is one of Taiwan's biggest allies today. But what if I told you that US once dropped over 30 tons of bombs into the heart of Taipei? During World War II, this flag didn't represent Taiwan, it represented the Republic of China that is representing what is now known as mainland China. Taiwan flew this flag instead, because it was part of the Japanese Empire, which made it one of the biggest foes to the United States in the Pacific Theater during World War II. In 2015, then President of Taiwan, or ROC, Ying-jeou, attended a teleconference for the Stanford University commemorating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. Or as he put it,
to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the ROC's victory in the resistance war against Japan.
The interesting thing is that he was most likely teleconferencing from the presidential office, where 70 years prior to that date was bombed by the US. We've collaborated with Asianometry to bring the story of the time that US bombed Taiwan.
As a Japanese colony, Taiwan had a crucial strategic role in the Empire of Japan's colonization of Asia. When the Japanese war effort began to crumble, the consequences of having such importance would reach Taiwan's shores. In this video, I want to talk about the time America bombed Taiwan. Japan had positioned Taiwan as a source of resources and soldiers to power the war effort. Taiwan's agricultural resources helped feed Japanese soldiers. Their southern industrial centers helped build aircraft and provide fuel for those planes, and several regiments were recruited out of Taiwan's people. When Japan idiotically began a violent war of Asian conquest, Taiwan Island became a natural target. At first, the airstrikes were tactical, minor actions that were taken when the opportunity presented itself. All of this was about to change, though, in 1944. In July 1944, US President FDR met with Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur to consult on strategy. For over a year and a half, Nimitz and his superior, Ernest King, had been at odds over the answer to a big question. Should the Americans push for the acquisition of the island of Luzon in the Philippines, or Taiwan, then referred to as Formosa? Most military planners saw Taiwan as strategically important to the war effort. Seizing the island would secure supply lines to mainland China, more seriously cut Japanese lines of communication to the rest of its empire, and allow American B-29s to drop heavier bomb loads on the home islands. Everyone agreed on this. The disagreement was over the sequence. Which should America take first? The debate was long, but eventually the American military establishment came to a shared consensus that a Luzon invasion presented far better prospects than Taiwan. The Philippines held value as a former American colony, and its reconquest would restore American prestige. The Americans eventually decided to skip Taiwan and focus on the Philippines. In October 1944, they would fight and win the Battle of Leyte Island and end 3 years of Japanese rule over the Philippines. Such a decision would have great consequences. It spared the Taiwanese from the destruction of an all-out American invasion. In the Battle of Leyte Island, the Americans positioned their Navy Fast Carrier Task Force, TF-38, to the southeast of Taiwan Island. They then launched daytime bombing raids on southern Taiwan in October 1944. The targets would be Taiwan's military facilities, sugar factories in Pingtung, the port of Kaohsiung, and the Gangshan aircraft manufacturing plant in Kaohsiung. From the 12th to the 17th, 4 detachments bombed targets. The Japanese Air Force launched to repel the invaders, but they were brushed away with ease. The Japanese would lose over 300 aircraft in what would later be called the Formosa air battle. The Japanese Navy would lose much of its potential air cover in this battle, a move with much consequence. On December 26, 1944, the Americans won the Battle of Leyte and gained total dominance of both the air and sea around the Philippines. Bombing raids to Taiwan would now come from there. The people of Tainan, terrified, would dig deep air raid trenches to protect themselves. The government began evacuating children living in the cities to the countryside for their safety. The bombing raids escalated. After January 11th, the US Air Force would launch over 7,700 sorties against Taiwan. They would drop 4,800 tons of fragmentation bombs and over 4,000 tons of napalm on Taiwanese targets, mostly airfields and ports. These sorties began as small-scale nighttime raids. The nighttime raids turned into daytime raids, with the February 27th bombing raid on the Kaohsiung port, and they diversified from purely military targets like the airfields and ports to industrial factories, bridges, and critical infrastructure. In April, to support American forces now fighting in the Japanese island of Okinawa, they had skipped Taiwan entirely. The 5th Air Force launched another large-scale attack on Taiwanese airfields so to destroy Japanese aircraft. This was largely successful. Taiwanese on the ground had no choice but to flee the bombings and watch their homes burn to the ground. The bombers were to only attack military and strategic targets, but as with all things in the fog of war, soldiers did not always follow orders to the letter. Streets, temples, churches, and marked hospitals also fell to the bombings. The May 31, 1945 Taipei Air Raid would be the biggest and most infamous American bombing of Taiwan. The 403rd Squadron sent 117 B-24s to conduct non-stop bombardment of Taipei from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Over 70,000 pounds of bombs were dropped on the city with little resistance from the Japanese. By now, the Japanese Air Force could no longer defend Taiwan in any shape or form. Various landmarks were destroyed in the raid, including the Penglai Catholic Church and the Damsui Theater. The governor's mansion, today the house of the Taiwan president, was severely damaged, hit by 2 bombs. While some reports say 3,000 people died in that raid, a contemporary Japanese report prepared by the Air Defense Division showed 759 deaths and 64 more missing. The bombings would continue into the summer, but by July 1945 they began to wane. The final bombing run happened in August 1945 with 8 fighters to attack the Hualien port. Then the Japanese surrendered in August 15, 1945, and it was over. After the war was over, the Americans dispatched a bombing investigations team to Taiwan in December 1945 to review and survey the damage. They surveyed the governor's office and also traveled to Keelung, Yilan, Ying-jeou, Taichung, Tainan, Kaohsiung, and Pingtung to make their evaluations. 6,100 people were killed in the bombing raids, 435 were missing, and 9,235 were injured. 46,000 homes were destroyed, leaving 277,380 people homeless. The majority of this damage was caused by bombs dropped by the American 5th Air Force. As Taiwan's industrial center, Kaohsiung was worst affected. It was the target of 20% of the bombing raids, with 30% of its homes destroyed or damaged in some form. World War II killed millions and changed the world forever. Compared to the horrific losses of major combatants like the Soviet Union, Germany, and mainland China, Taiwan went through the war relatively unscathed. Taiwan was a crucial part of the Japanese war machine, feeding it agricultural goods and industrial items. America sought to cut those off with strategic bombings of that infrastructure. Raiders sought to restrain themselves to only strategic targets, but they were not always successful. The result was the horrific loss of civilian life. After Taiwan was ceded to the Republic of China and Chiang Kai-shek took over, his regime's history books focused heavily on the Second Sino-Japanese War, literally known in Chinese as the Chinese Anti-Japanese War, which is somewhat fair being that it was one of the biggest wars in history and a great victory. But Taiwan's role in the war and the consequences of such were shoved off to the side. Taiwan's bombings are now largely forgotten. Forgotten to such an extent that sometimes Taiwanese people would say that it was the Japanese who bombed Tainan, Kaohsiung, and all those cities, a sentiment that I find somewhat baffling. It is hard to find remainders of this memory in the modern buildings of Taipei, but if you go to Tainan and look for it, you will find little reminders of that sad past.
Fast forward a couple of decades, US and Taiwan now have one of the strongest military pacts. There's even something called the Taiwan Relations Act. Make sure to check out Asianometry for other things about Taiwan and Asia. At the same time, make sure to like and subscribe over here for more Taiwan stories. I'll see you around. I think that's good.